Zaynu'l-Muqarrabín. This distinguished man was one of the greatest of all the Bab's companions and all the loved ones of Baha'u'llah. When he lived under Islam, he was already famed for his purity and holiness of life. He was talented and highly accomplished in many directions. He was the leader and spiritual exemplar of the entire population of Najaf-abad, and the eminent of that area showed him unbounded respect. When he spoke out, his was the deciding opinion. When he passed judgment, it took effect, for he was known to all as the standard and his authority of last resort. He had no sooner learned of the Bab's declaration than he cried out from the depths of his heart, quote, "O our Lord, we have indeed heard the voice of one that called. He called us to the faith. Believe ye on your Lord, and we have believed." Unquote. He rid himself of all impending veils. His doubts dispelled, he began to extol and glorify the beauty promised from of old. In his own home and at Isfahan, he became notorious for declaring far and wide that the advent of the long-desired one had come to pass. By the hypocrites he was mocked, cursed, and tormented. As for the people, quote, "the mass as a snake in the grass," unquote, who had worshipped him before, now rose up to do him harm. Every day brought on a fresh cruelty, a new torment from his oppressors. He endured it all and went on teaching with great eloquence. He remained staunch, unmoved as their wrath increased. In his hands he held out a full cup of divine glad tidings, offering to all who came that heady draught of the knowledge of God. He was utterly without fear, knew nothing of danger, and swiftly followed the holy path of the Lord. After the attempt on the Shah, however, there was no shelter anywhere, no evening, no morning, without intense affliction. And since his staying on in Najaf-abad at such a time was a great danger to the believers, he left there and traveled to Iraq. It was during the period when the Blessed Beauty was in Kurdistan, when he had gone into seclusion and was living in the cave on Sargalo, that Jinabizan arrived in Baghdad. But his hopes were dashed, his heart grieved, for all was silence. There was no word of the cause of God, no name nor fame of it. There were no gatherings, no call was being raised. Yahya, terror-stricken, had vanished into some dark hiding-place. Torpid, flaccid, he had made himself invisible. Try as he might, Jinabizan could find not one soul. He met on a single occasion with His Eminence Kalim, but it was a period when great caution was being exercised by the believers, and he went on to Karbala. He spent some time there and occupied himself with copying out the writings, after which he returned home to Najaf-abad. There the foul persecutions and attacks of his relentless enemies could hardly be endured. But when the trump had been sounded a second time, he was restored to life. To the tidings of Baha'u'llah's advent, his soul replied to the drumbeat, "Am I not your Lord?" His heart drummed back, "Yea, verily." Eloquently he taught again, using both rational and historical proofs, to establish that he whom God shall make manifest, that is, the promised one of the Bab, had indeed appeared. He was like refreshing waters to those who thirsted, and to seekers a clear answer from the concourse on high. In his writings and speaking he was first among the righteous. In his elucidations and commentaries a mighty sign of God. In Persia his life was in imminent peril, and since remaining at Najaf-abad would have stirred up the agitators and brought on riots, he hastened away to Adrianople, seeking sanctuary with God, and crying out as he went, "Lord, Lord, here am I." Wearing the lover's pilgrim dress, he reached the Mecca of his longing. For some time he tarried there in the presence of Baha'u'llah, after which he was commanded to leave with Janabi Mírzá Ja'far-i-Yazdí and promulgate the faith. He returned to Persia and began to teach most eloquently, so that the glad tidings of the Lord's advent resounded to the high heavens. In the company of Mírzá Ja'far he traveled everywhere, through cities flourishing and ruined, spreading the good news that the Blessed Beauty was now manifest. Once again he returned to Iraq, where he was the center of every gathering and rejoiced his hearers. At all times he gave wise counsel. At all times he was consumed with the love of God. When the believers were taken prisoner in Iraq and banished to Mosul, Zan became their chief. He remained for some time in Mosul, a consolation to the rest, working to solve their many problems. He would kindle love in people's hearts and make them kind to one another. Later he asked for permission to attend upon Baha'u'llah. When this was granted, he arrived at the prison and had the honor of entering the presence of his well-beloved. He then busied himself with writing down the sacred verses and encouraging the friends. He was love itself to the emigrants and warmed the travelers' hearts. He never rested for a moment and received new grace and bounty every day, meanwhile taking down the Baha'I scriptures with faultless care. From his early years till his last breath, this eminent man never failed in service to the manifestation. After the ascension, he was consumed with such grieving, such constant tears and anguish, that as the days passed by, he wasted away. He remained faithful to the covenant, and was a close companion to this servant of the light of the world, but he longed to rise out of this life, and awaited his departure from day to day. At last, serene and happy, rejoicing in the tidings of the kingdom, he soared away to that mysterious land. There he was loosed from every sorrow, and the gathering place of splendors he was immersed in light. Unto him be salutations and praise from the luminous realm, and the glory of the all-glorious, from the concourse on high, and great joy in that kingdom which endures forever. May God provide him with an exalted station in the Abha paradise. Aẓím-i-Tafríshí. This man of God came from the district of Tafrish. He was detached from the world, fearless, independent of kindred and stranger alike. He was one of the earliest believers and belonged to the company of the faithful. It was in Persia that he won the honor of belief and began to assist the friends. He was a servant to every believer, a trusted helper to every traveler. With Mosei Khumi, upon whom be the glory of God, he came to Iraq, received his portion of bounty from the light of the world, and was honored with entering the presence of Baha'u'llah, attending upon him and becoming the object of bestowals and grace. After a time, Aẓím and Haji Mírzá went back to Persia, where he continued to render service to the friends purely for God's sake. Without wage or stipend, he served Mírzá Nasrullah of Tafrish for a number of years, his faith and certitude growing stronger with every passing day. Mírzá Nasrullah then left Persia for Adrianople, and in his company came Janabi Aẓím, and entered the presence of Baha'u'llah. He kept on serving with love and loyalty, purely for the sake of God, and when the convoy departed for Akka, Aẓím received the distinction of accompanying Baha'u'llah, and he entered the most great prison. In the prison he was chosen to serve the household. He became the water carrier both within doors and on the outside. He undertook many hard tasks in the barracks. He had no rest at all, day or night. Aẓím, quote, the great, the magnificent, unquote, was magnificent as to character. He was patient, long-suffering, forbearing, shunning the stain of this earth, and since he was the family water carrier, he had the honor of coming into Baha'u'llah's presence every day. He was a good companion to all the friends, a consolation to their hearts. He brought happiness to all of them, the present and the absent as well. Many and many a time Baha'u'llah was heard to express his approval of this man. He always maintained the same inner condition. He was constant, never subject to change. He was always happy-looking. He did not know the meaning of fatigue. He was never despondent. When anyone asked a service of him, he performed it at once. He was staunch and firm in his faith, a tree that grew in the scented garden of God's tenderness. After he had served at the holy threshold for many long years, he hastened away, tranquil, serene, rejoicing in the tidings of the kingdom, out of this swiftly fading life to the world that does not die. The friends, all of them, mourned his passing, but the Blessed Beauty eased their hearts, for he lavished grace and praise on him who was gone. Mercies be upon Aẓím from the kingdom of divine compassion. God's glory be upon him at nightfall and the rising of the sun. Mírzá Ja'far-i-Yazdí. This knight of the battlefield was one of the most learned seekers after truth, well versed in many branches of knowledge. For a long time he was in the schools, specializing in the fundamentals of religion and religious jurisprudence, and making researches into philosophy and metaphysics, logic and history, the contemplative and the narrated sciences. Footnote: Manqul va maqul, desumed versus excogitated, or knowledge. End of footnote. He began, however, to note that his fellows were arrogant and self-satisfied, and this repelled him. It was then that he heard the cry out of the supreme concourse, and without a moment's hesitation he raised up his voice and shouted, "Yea, verily," and he repeated the words, "O our Lord, we have heard the voice of one that called. He called us to the faith. Believe ye on your Lord, and we have believed." The Quran 3:190. When he saw the great tumult and the riots in Yazd, he left his homeland and went to Najaf, the noble city. Here, for safety's sake, he mingled with the scholars of religion, becoming renowned among them for his own wide knowledge. Then, listening to the voice from Baghdad, he hastened there and changed his mode of dress. That is, he put a layman's hat on his head and went to work as a carpenter to earn his living. He traveled once to Tehran, returned and sheltered by the grace of Baha'u'llah, was patient and content, rejoicing in his garb of poverty. In spite of his great learning, he was humble, self-effacing, lowly. He kept silent at all times, and was a good companion to every sort of man. On the journey from Iraq to Constantinople, Mírzá Ja'far was one of Baha'u'llah's retinue, and in seeing to the needs of the friends, he was a partner to this servant. When he would come to a stopping place, the believers, exhausted by the long hours of travel, would rest or sleep. Mírzá Ja'far and I would go here and there to the surrounding villages to find oats, straw, and other provisions for the caravan. Footnote: Baha'u'llah was accompanied by members of his family and 26 disciples. The convoy included a mounted guard of 10 soldiers with their officer, a train of 50 mules, and 7 pairs of howdahs, each pair surmounted by 4 parasols. The journey to Constantinople lasted from May the 3rd, 1863, to August the 16th. End of footnote. Since there was a famine in that area, it sometimes happened that we would be roaming from village to village from after the noon hour until half the night was gone. As best we could, we would procure whatever was available, then return to the convoy. Mírzá Ja'far was patient, long-suffering, a faithful attendant at the holy threshold. He was a servant to all the friends, working day and night, a quiet man, sparing of speech, in all things relying entirely upon God. He continued to serve in Adrianople until the banishment to Akka was brought about, and he too was made a prisoner. He was grateful for this, continuing offering thanks, and saying, "Praise be to God, I am in the fully laden ark." The prison was a garden of roses to him, and his narrow cell a wide and fragrant place. At the time when we were in the barracks, he fell dangerously ill and was confined to his bed. He suffered many complications until finally the doctor gave him up and would visit him no more. Then the sick man breathed his last. Mírzá Akhajan ran to Baha'u'llah with the word of the death. Not only had the patient ceased to breathe, but his body was already going limp. His family were gathered about him, mourning him, shedding bitter tears. The Blessed Beauty said, quote, "Go, chant the prayer of Ya Shafi'i, O thou the healer, and Mírzá Ja'far will come alive. Very rapidly he will be as well as ever." Unquote. I reached his bedside. His body was cold, and all the signs of death were present. Slowly he began to stir. Soon he could move his limbs, and before an hour had passed, he lifted his head, sat up, and proceeded to laugh and tell jokes. He lived for a long time after that, occupied as ever with serving the friends. This giving service was a point of pride with him. To all he was a servant. He was always modest and humble, calling God to mind, and to the highest degree full of hope and faith. Finally, while in the most great prison, he abandoned this earthly life, and winged his way to the life beyond. Greetings and praise be unto him. Upon him be the glory of the All-Glorious, and the favoring glances of the Lord. His luminous grave is in Achā.